The applause hit Sophia Castellan like a wall of sound she had not prepared for. Not because it was loud, but because it was so completely wrong for the moment, and yet everyone around her seemed to find it perfectly appropriate. 30 people in expensive clothes were clapping and smiling and looking at her with the warm, satisfied expressions of people who have just watched something pleasant happen, and Sophia stood at her seat with her glass raised, and her face arranged into the expression she had been perfecting since she was 11 years old, and she felt absolutely nothing. Not happiness, not fear, not even the cautious, guarded curiosity she had expected to feel. Just a long, flat quiet, as if someone had pressed a hand against the window of her inner life and blocked out all the sound. Her father was still speaking. Edmund Castellan, at 63, was still the most commanding presence in any room he entered, and he entered a lot of rooms. He had the voice of a man who had never once said something, and wondered whether he would be heard. He stood at the head of the table, a glass of wine in one hand, and he spoke about the future with the confidence of someone who had personally arranged it. The merger of two great families, the joining of the Castellan name with the Voss name, a new chapter, a new era. He used all the words that suited the occasion, and the people around the table listened with the attentiveness of those who understood that they were watching something significant. Sophia turned her head to the far end of the long table. Dorian Voss was seated there, and he was smiling in a way that was easy and warm, and said, "I belong in this picture." He was tall and well presented, his features even, his eyes a steady gray blue that caught the candlelight from the center of the table. He looked, in every possible way, like exactly what he was supposed to be. The ideal match, the right name, the perfect continuation of everything Edmund Castellan had built. He caught her eye. She held his gaze for 2 seconds, the amount of time that read as connection, without becoming something too personal, in a room full of watching people, and she gave him a small, warm smile, and he gave her one back. And in the private space behind that smile, Sophia was making a list. She had been making lists her entire life, silently, in the back of her mind, in the spaces where other people simply reacted. It was how she had gotten through her childhood, and her education, and every public event that had ever required her to be present when she would rather have been somewhere else. She made lists and she thought clearly, and she remained functional and composed while the world performed itself around her. The list she was making now was short. It was 3 words long. I do not know him. That was the whole of it, and it was enough to shift something very quietly and very permanently inside her chest. She knew Dorian Voss's name, of course. She knew his public history, which was polished and well-maintained, as all public histories of wealthy men tend to be. She knew which boards he sat on, and which charities claimed his association, and which photographs he appeared in, and what the press said about him, which was uniformly flattering, because the people who controlled the press coverage of families like the Voss family also controlled a great many other things, and they were careful. She had met him at 3 dinners over the course of 4 months. She had spoken to him directly for perhaps 90 minutes in total, across all 3 occasions. She had never been alone with him in a room. She had never seen him when he was not prepared to be seen. She had never watched him interact with a stranger, or someone who worked for him, or someone who had nothing to offer him. She had never seen him at 7 in the morning, or when he was tired, or when he was angry, or when he thought no one was looking. She did not know him, and she was being asked to spend the rest of her life beside him. The dinner lasted 3 more hours after the announcement. Sophia was gracious and warm and present for every minute of it. She answered questions about the upcoming ceremony with exactly the right level of excitement. She accepted embraces from people she barely knew, who told her she was glowing, and that this was wonderful, and that they had always hoped for exactly this. She shook hands. She laughed at the appropriate moments. She caught her father's eye twice across the table, and each time she gave him the look that said everything is fine, which was the look he had taught her to give, without ever quite meaning to teach her anything. She drove herself home. Her driver, George Alderton, had offered the car for the evening, but Sophia preferred to drive when she needed to think, because it gave her something to do with her hands and her eyes, while the real work happened in the back of her mind. She was out of the neighborhood before she called Clara. Clara Bennett picked up on the second ring, which meant she had been expecting the call or had been awake anyway, and with Clara it was usually both. "Tell me what you are thinking," Clara said. She did not ask how the dinner had gone. They both already knew how the dinner had gone. I do not know this man, Sophia said. A pause. No, Clara agreed. I have 22 days before this engagement becomes the kind of thing that cannot be quietly reversed without causing real damage to my father's business relationships and to the alliance he has spent 6 months building. After those 22 days, I am in the middle of something that is significantly harder to step away from. Yes, Clara said. I want to know who he is before that happens. I want to see who he is in his own house, when he is not being watched by anyone he considers important. How? Clara said, though she said it in the tone of a woman who was already beginning to suspect the answer. Sophia told her. The silence that followed was the longest Clara had ever given her. Clara was not a person who paused without reason. She was precise and fast-thinking, and she had learned in 4 years of working alongside Sophia that Sophia's instincts were worth taking seriously. But this particular silence lasted 7 seconds, which was 7 seconds longer than most of their conversations required. You want to go into the Voss estate, Clara said at last, as a member of household staff. A temporary placement. The estate uses an outside agency. They process a high volume of applications, and their background checks are basic. Clara, you and I have built cleaner identities than this, for far smaller reasons. We built identities to protect your privacy. We did not build them so you could go and work in the house of the man your father has spent 6 months negotiating an engagement with. The principle is the same. The principle is entirely different. Will you help me? A breath. Talk me through it. She was parked by this point, pulled to the side of a quiet street, with the engine off, and the windows showing her a stretch of empty pavement lit by a yellow street lamp. She talked Clara through the whole shape of the plan. The false identity, the placement agency, the length of time, the cover she would need. Clara listened without interrupting, which meant she was thinking rather than objecting, and when Sophia finished, Clara was quiet again, but this time it was the quiet of a person building rather than doubting. I will need until Thursday to do this properly, Clara said. A real work history, references that will hold up to a basic check, the right paperwork. Nothing impressive, just solid and unremarkable. Good. You will need to look unremarkable too. I know. I am already handling that. Your hair, Clara said, with a very specific flatness. Tonight. Another pause. What is your cover name? Sophia Marin. You already had the name. I have been thinking about this since the car ride home. That was 20 minutes ago. I think quickly. Clara made a sound that was not quite a laugh, and not quite exasperation, but was somewhere between the two, and entirely affectionate. I will call you Thursday with the confirmation. In the meantime, do not do anything that might put your photograph in front of anyone connected to the Voss family. Obviously. And Sophia, be careful. I am always careful. No, Clara said plainly. You are almost always careful. There is a difference. They hung up, and Sophia sat for another moment, with the quiet of the empty street around her, and thought about her grandmother. Her grandmother had been the most practical woman Sophia had ever known. Not cold, but clear. She had grown up without money, and then married into it, and she had never lost the clear-eyed quality that came from having known both sides of that line. She used to sit with Sophia in her garden and say things that Sophia had not fully understood at the time, but had been absorbing quietly for years since. The one she was thinking about now had been said on an afternoon in early autumn, when Sophia was 12, and had been excitedly describing a new friend she had made at school, a girl who seemed wonderful and impressive, and who had taken a particular interest in Sophia. Her grandmother had listened to the whole description, without expression. Then she had asked one question. How does she treat the people who serve her lunch? Sophia had not known how to answer, because she had not been paying attention. Her grandmother had nodded, as if this was exactly the answer she had expected. Before you trust someone with your future, she had said, watch how they treat someone who has nothing to offer them. That is the only truly honest version of a person. Everything else is performance. The friendship had not lasted 6 months. The other girl's interest in Sophia had been connected entirely to what the Castellan name could provide, and once it became clear that access was not forthcoming, the interest dissolved. Sophia had not been devastated. She had, instead, remembered her grandmother's question and filed it away. She had filed it with many other things her grandmother had taught her, and had carried them through the years that followed, and had never, until now, had occasion to test that particular lesson in quite this direct a way. She started the car and drove home. She cut her hair in her bathroom at 11:30 that night. She did not make it dramatic. She was not trying to create a disguise so complete that no one could ever see through it. She was simply trying to be unremarkable, to remove the specific visual markers that made Sofia Castellan recognizable. She cut 7 inches off the length. She removed the soft, careful wave that her stylist maintained every 3 weeks. What remained was a clean, flat cut at her jawline. And she looked at it and thought, yes, that is someone different. The hair color came 2 days later, from a box she purchased with cash from a large supermarket in a neighborhood where she was unlikely to be recognized. A deep chestnut brown, 2 shades darker than her natural color. Applied on a Wednesday evening, rinsed out, dried with a plain towel, and then assessed in a bathroom mirror with the practical eye of someone deciding whether something is going to work. It was going to work. She spent those preparation days doing something that required more focus than the physical transformation. She practiced being invisible, not invisible in any fanciful sense, but invisible in the way that certain people are genuinely not noticed in rooms, not because no one can see them, but because no one is moved to look. She practiced the particular quality of stillness that belongs to someone who has learned through long experience that being noticed is not always useful. She moved around her apartment with slightly different posture, shoulders slightly forward, movement contained, eyes open but not seeking. She watched how she naturally took up space, and she deliberately reduced it. She watched how she naturally commanded attention, the subtle ways she had been trained since childhood to signal that she expected to be acknowledged, and she untrained them, one by one, standing in her kitchen, walking down her corridor, carrying things in the specific way of someone for whom carrying is not ceremonial, but practical. On Sunday, she packed the bag, a small canvas bag that could hold everything she needed, 3 changes of plain, clean clothes purchased from a second-hand shop, flat shoes that were worn enough to look real, the phone Clara had prepared, with a fresh number and a clean account history that connected to nothing in Sofia's real life, a notebook and 2 pens, a small camera, disguised as a coat button, that a contact of Clara's had sourced and configured for exactly this kind of purpose, her medication in an unmarked container, and in the deepest interior pocket of the bag, folded inside a plain white envelope, the photograph of her grandmother in the garden. She did not carry it for sentiment. She carried it because some objects are simply anchoring, and she intended to be fully present in what she was about to do. Clara sent the confirmation that evening. Placement confirmed. Monday, 6 in the morning, service entrance. Sofia read it twice, put the phone down, and sat for a while at her kitchen table without doing anything. Then she went to bed. She did not sleep well, but not from fear. She was not afraid. She was in a state of complete alertness that makes sleep difficult simply because the mind has too much to do, too many variables to process and arrange. At 4 in the morning she gave up on sleep entirely and sat at the table again with a cup of tea and thought through every angle she had not already covered. At 5:15, she picked up her bag and her coat and her keys, and she left. The drive to the Voss estate took 22 minutes in the empty early morning. She parked 2 streets away and walked to the service entrance at the rear of the property. She stood in front of a plain wooden door in the gray pre-dawn cold with her canvas bag at her feet and her hands very still. She knocked 3 times. The woman who opened the door was somewhere in her mid-50s and had the kind of face that has been competent for so long that competence has become its permanent expression. She looked at Sofia the way a person looks at a piece of equipment they need to decide whether to trust, quickly and completely and without sentiment. "Sophia Marine," she said. "Yes," Sophia said. "Hilda Morgan. I manage this household." A pause, a fraction of a second, while she noted something. "You are early. That is noted and appreciated. Come in." The door opened. Sophia walked through it. The corridor beyond was narrow and cleanly lit and smelled of lemon cleaning product and the warm, yeasty smell of bread beginning to bake somewhere further along. Plain stone floors, plain white walls, everything spotlessly maintained, with no interest in decoration, only in function. This was the real house, the house below the house. The door closed behind her with a firm, final sound. Sophia followed Hilda Morgan down the corridor, her canvas bag at her side, her face clear of any expression that might raise a question. Somewhere above the stone ceiling of this service corridor, the Voss family was sleeping in rooms that cost more to furnish than most people earned in a year. Out there was marble and antique wood, and paintings in gilded frames. Down here was stone and cleaning solution, and the sound of footsteps that no one in the house above would ever register. She had spent 27 years on the other side of this division. She had 2 weeks to understand what was on this one. She kept her shoulders level, her breathing even, and her eyes open, and she followed Hilda Morgan deeper into the house. She was on her knees, in the east corridor, at 5 minutes past 5 in the morning, scrubbing the grout between the floor tiles with a brush that had seen better years, when she understood for the first time what it actually meant to be invisible in a house like this. It did not mean that no one could see you. It meant that people looked at you and saw only the task you were performing. The mop, the bucket, the scrubbing brush, the cloth. You were an extension of these objects. You were the mechanism by which the house cleaned itself. And because people in houses like this one did not think of mechanisms as having interior lives, they said things in front of you that they would not say if they thought you were truly present. She had been at the Voss estate for 36 hours, and she had already heard more than she had expected to hear. But she kept her focus on the grout, and the brush, and the bucket of cold soapy water, and she thought about those 36 hours methodically, the way she thought about everything. Hilda Morgan had put her through the paces without apology or sentimentality, from the very first morning. There was a list, and on the list was everything that needed to be done in this wing of the house before the family appeared for breakfast at 8:30. The east corridor tiles, the windows of the ground floor sitting room, the laying of the dining table, which had a precise and formal arrangement that Hilda expected to be followed without error, the collection of used linens from the guest rooms, the polishing of the hall mirror to a standard that, as Hilda had put it on the first morning, leaves no evidence that anyone has ever touched it. This was not said unkindly. Hilda Morgan was not a kind woman or an unkind one. She was a precise woman, and precision was the value she applied to everything, including the people who worked under her. She expected the work to be done correctly, and she had no particular interest in how you felt about doing it. Sophia did the work correctly. She was not skilled at all of it, not yet, but she was fast at learning, and she had the kind of stubborn attention to detail that made her useful from the first day. Hilda noticed this without commenting on it, which Sophia had learned quickly was Hilda's version of approval. The other staff she had met in those first 36 hours were a different education entirely. Beatrice Fletcher, who everyone called B, was 23 years old, which made her 4 years younger than Sophia, and she had been working at the Voss estate for 14 months. That was long enough to know how things worked, and young enough to still feel the weight of how things worked. She had reddish-brown hair that she kept in a tight braid under her work cap, and she moved through the house with the practiced efficiency of someone who has learned exactly which floorboards creak and how to avoid them. She had given Sophia the tour on the first morning, walking her quickly through the below-stairs geography of the house, while Hilda oversaw the kitchen delivery. The tour was practical, and delivered in a low, quick voice that was entirely different from the voice B used when any member of the family might be within earshot. "Linen room is at the end of this corridor," Bea had said. "You need a key for the supply cabinet. Hilda keeps it. Do not go into the east wing without specific instructions, ever. If you see Mrs. Voss coming down a corridor, find a reason to be in a doorway, because she does not like passing staff in the hall." A pause, and then, as if deciding something, "And do not ask questions about why things are the way they are. Just do the work and keep your head down." Sophia had nodded, as if this was standard housekeeping advice and nothing more. Inside, she noted every word. Thomas Ward was the groundskeeper, and he was 61 years old, and he had been working for the Voss family for 19 years. He was the kind of man who moved slowly, not because he was slow, but because he had learned over a very long time that hurrying rarely improved anything. He maintained the formal gardens and the kitchen garden and the greenhouse at the back of the property, and he was the first person Sophia had met at the estate who seemed completely unafraid of everything around him. He had looked at her on the first morning when Bea introduced them in the kitchen corridor, and he had nodded at her with the kind of straightforward warmth that has no agenda behind it. "New girl," he said. "Welcome. The work is hard, but the coffee is good. That is what matters." Rodrigo Santos worked in the kitchen under the head chef, and was responsible for everything the head chef considered beneath his direct attention, which turned out to be a great deal. He was 28 and had a very specific quality that Sophia had seen in very few people. He could find something genuinely funny in almost any situation without needing anyone else to find it funny with him. He kept the kitchen atmosphere functional when it might otherwise have become tense, and he did this entirely through the economy of his humor, which was dry and never mean. Nina Cole was the other day maid. She was 35 and quiet in a way that was not shyness but simply preference. She had worked at the estate for 3 years and was very good at the work and very careful about everything outside it. These were the people Sophia spent her first days alongside, in the below-stairs world of the Voss estate, and she liked them. She had not expected to like them as simply and immediately as she did, but she did, and she was careful not to let that become something that made her careless. She was here to watch, and to listen, and to understand. She was not here to make connections that could compromise what she needed to do. She was also watching the fear. It was not obvious. It was not the fear of people in immediate danger. It was something older and more worn into the daily life of the house, like a smell in a room that has been there long enough that no one consciously registers it anymore. But it affects everything. The way eyes moved toward a door when a certain sound was heard in the corridor above. The way conversations stopped and resumed on safer topics when the sound of particular footsteps crossed the ceiling overhead. The way B's whole posture changed when certain names were mentioned. On the second afternoon, Sophia was carrying a stack of pressed linens to the upper guest floor when she passed the open door of a small sitting room on the first level and heard a voice that stopped her mid-step. Not because it was raised, because it was not raised, and that made it worse. The voice belonged to Irene Voss, Dorian's mother, and it was the kind of voice that has been quietly powerful for so long that it no longer needs volume to carry weight. It was low and clear and completely without warmth, and it was speaking to someone Sophia could not see from the corridor, and what it was saying was this: "I asked for the vase to be moved 2 days ago. This is not a request that required 2 days. When I ask for something to be done, I expect it to be done before I have to think about it again. If I have to think about it again, it means someone in this house has decided that my time and my instructions are optional. They are not optional." A silence followed. Then a very young voice, quiet and controlled in the way of someone trying hard not to show distress. "I am sorry, Mrs. Voss. It will not happen again." "No," Irene Voss said, "it will not." A door clicked, footsteps moved away, and then there was silence, and Sophia stood in the corridor with the linen stack in her arms, and she did not move for a moment because she was thinking about the voice, about the quality of it, about the way it had been aimed not at someone's actions, but at their sense of themselves, at the part of a person that needed to feel they were acceptable, and it had been aimed there precisely and deliberately, and then it had moved on, as if the person it had been aimed at was simply not worth more than that. That was cruelty, in its most efficient form. Not dramatic, not loud, just precise and cold and purposeful. Sophia walked on, her face composed, the linen stack in her arms, and she filed away what she had just heard. She saw Irene Voss at closer range the following morning, when Irene crossed the main entrance hall, at a time when Sophia was collecting the morning papers from the entry table, and had no convenient reason to disappear. Irene did not look at her, not in the deliberate way of someone choosing not to look, but in the complete and natural way of someone who genuinely did not register her presence. She moved through the hall in a long pale dressing gown, her hair arranged even at this hour, her movement precise and unhurried, and she did not break stride or glance to the side, and she was through the hall and around the corner, before Sophia had taken 3 breaths. Sophia stood there for a moment after she was gone. She had been in the presence of powerful and difficult people before. She had attended enough functions and sat through enough dinners to have developed a reliable internal calibration for the various types of power and how they expressed themselves. What she had just been in the presence of was something specific, not the crude power of someone who had to remind others of their position, the settled, absolute power of someone who had never once in their life needed to remind anyone of anything, because the reminder was built into every movement they made. Irene Voss made the air in a room different when she was in it, and the particular quality of that difference was something Sophia stored carefully, because it told her something about the house she was in, and about the family she had been invited to join. On the evening of the third day, she was folding towels in the linen room with B when she heard something else. Voices from the service telephone near the kitchen, which was used for household communications. She could not make out the words, but she heard Hilda's voice, and then a pause, and then Hilda's voice again, shorter and flat. Hilda came out of the call and walked past the linen room without looking in, and her face was the face of a person who has just been told to do something they do not entirely want to do but will do anyway, because there is no alternative. 20 minutes later, Sophia was in the corridor near the boot room when she saw a young man she had not been introduced to, walking toward the service exit with a bag over his shoulder and his eyes on the floor. He was perhaps 19 or 20. He walked quickly, and he did not look up. Bia appeared at Sophia's elbow. "Who is that?" Sophia asked quietly. "Danny Cole. He worked in the boot room and the garden with Tomas." A pause. "He has been let go." "Just now?" "Yes." "Why?" Bea was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with the careful evenness of someone who has thought about something and decided how much to say, "They do not really explain why. They just say your services are no longer needed, and then you go." "Has it happened before?" Bea looked at her. It was a brief look, but it covered a great deal of ground. "Sophia," she said, using Sophia's cover name in the quiet, practical way she had from the start. "The work here is good, and the pay is regular, and most of the time it is fine. But you need to understand something about this house." She folded the last towel in her stack. "People who stay quiet and do their work well, and do not ask questions, last a long time here. People who get comfortable, or start noticing things that are not their business, they do not last." She picked up her pile. "I like you. You seem smart, so keep your head down and do the work, and you will be fine." She walked away down the corridor, and Sophia watched her go, and then she turned and walked in the opposite direction, toward the room she had been given, which was small, and clean, and plain, and she sat on the edge of the narrow bed, and she thought. She thought about the young man walking out with a bag over his shoulder, and his eyes on the floor. She thought about the voice of Irene Voss in that sitting room. She thought about Bea's warning, which had been given in genuine kindness, and which told her more about this house than a week of observation could have. She thought about the list. "I do not know him." She was learning, and what she was learning did not yet add up to anything specific, anything she could point to and name, but it was adding up to an atmosphere, and the atmosphere was this. Something in this house was being very carefully managed, and the management required that certain people remain quiet and not stay long enough to understand too much. She opened the small notebook she kept in her bag, and she wrote 3 lines. Not information, questions. The kinds of questions that, if answered, would tell her whether what she was sensing was real, or simply the discomfort of a person adjusting to unfamiliar circumstances. Then, she put the notebook away and went to wash her face and prepare for the next morning, which would start at 5 o'clock, and which would require her to be on the floor of the east corridor with a scrubbing brush before anyone in the house above had opened their eyes. She set the alarm. She turned off the light. She lay on the narrow bed in the dark, and she thought about the questions on the notebook page and the atmosphere of the house around her, and she did not allow herself to conclude anything yet, because she had always known that conclusions reached too early have a way of fitting themselves to the evidence rather than the other way around. She would wait. She would watch. She had not come this far to rush. On the morning of the 4th day, she passed Tomas Ward in the kitchen corridor before the day had properly begun, while the coffee brewed and the house above was still dark. He was speaking to Rodrigo in a low voice, and she caught the tail end of it as she went to the supply room for her morning equipment. She heard Tomas say, with the simple plainness of a man who has long since stopped dressing things up, "That is 3 and 12 days. They are clearing people out. Something is shifting in this house." Rodrigo said nothing. He just poured the coffee and handed Tomas his cup, and they both stood in the early morning corridor, and neither of them added anything, because sometimes there is nothing to add. Sophia collected her bucket and her brush and went to start the morning. But she carried those words with her all day. 3 and 12 days. Something is shifting in this house. When she lay down that evening in the narrow bed, she lay there with her eyes open for a long time. She had come here with a question about one man. She was beginning to understand that the question was about something larger and more deliberate than one man's character. She was going to find out what it was. and she was going to find it out before she left. She was carrying a silver coffee tray down the main corridor toward the breakfast room when she heard Dorian Voss before she saw him. He was on the telephone, somewhere just around the corner ahead of her, and his voice was doing the thing that she would come to understand was its default register. Low, easy, conversational. The voice of a man who is always slightly more relaxed than the situation around him, as if he arrived at every moment having already settled it internally. She heard him say something that made the person on the other end laugh, and then she turned the corner, and there he was. He was standing in the entrance to the main hallway, with his phone to his ear, wearing a dark jacket over a pale shirt, and he was tall, in the way that well-built men of a certain type are tall, not imposing, but present, taking up the right amount of space without appearing to try. He was 32 years old, and he looked exactly that, but in the specific way of someone who has spent 32 years in comfortable circumstances, without the kind of accumulated wear that the same number of years produces in someone carrying more weight. He did not look at her when she came around the corner. He was focused on his call. She moved to the side of the corridor, tray balanced, making herself part of the background the way she had been practicing, and she was almost past him when he finished the call and lowered the phone and looked up, and they briefly, directly, made eye contact. For a fraction of a second, something moved across his face. Not recognition, she was certain of that. Something more like the reflex awareness that most people have when they register another person unexpectedly in their space. It lasted less than a second, and then he did something she had not expected. He said, "Thank you for making room. Good morning." She said, "Good morning, sir," in the quiet and unremarkable way that belonged to Sophia Marin, and she walked on with the tray, and she turned the corner into the breakfast room corridor, and she set the tray down on the side table, and she stood very still for a moment. He had said thank you for making room in a corridor that was his, in his house, that she had moved out of, because it was simply what was required. It cost him nothing to say it. People did small kind things all the time, without it meaning anything significant about their character. She was not going to build a picture of Dorian Voss out of 2 words said in passing. She picked up the tray and went to set the breakfast table. But she stored the moment, because every detail was a data point, and she had not come here to be selective about which data points she collected. Over the next 4 days, she watched him in every situation that her role gave her access to. Not all the time, and not so intently that she risked being noticed watching, but the role she had been assigned meant that she was regularly in the rooms where he moved, and she was almost always invisible enough that he did not register her presence, which was exactly what she needed. She watched him eat breakfast alone at the long table, reading from a laptop, drinking black coffee, entirely self-contained. She watched him take calls in the garden, pacing slowly along the gravel path near the kitchen garden wall, his voice too low to hear, but his posture shifting with the calls, in ways she noted. She watched him speak to Hilda twice, once about a dinner arrangement and once about a delivery, and both times he was direct and clear, and did not take the small opportunities that some people in his position took to establish the power difference, the slight extra sharpness in tone, or the deliberate half-second delay before acknowledging a response. So far, the picture was incomplete, but not damning. A man who moved through the world with ease, and who did not, in these small observable moments, treat the people around him badly. But she had learned a long time ago that what a person does in the small observable moments is only part of the picture. The more important part is what they do when they believe the small moments are not being observed at all. She kept watching. She watched him with his mother. That was the most instructive thing she had seen so far. Irene Voss joined him for dinner on the 5th evening, which Sophia knew because she helped lay the dining room for 2, and she was called to clear the first course while they were eating. She moved through the room as quietly and invisibly as she had learned to move, and she listened to the conversation. The relationship between Dorian and his mother was civil and specific. They talked about business with the mutual fluency of people who have always used business as the primary language between them. They discussed timelines, contacts, decisions pending. Irene referenced several upcoming things with a precision that suggested she was more directly involved in the day-to-day operations of the Voss Group than her public role as a social figure implied. Dorian deferred to her on certain points, in ways that were subtle enough to seem like simple agreement, but that Sophia, listening from the edge of the room, thought were more than that. He did not disagree with his mother in her presence, not even mildly, not even on the small things. He either agreed with her immediately, or he redirected the conversation with a kind of practiced smoothness that moved past the point of potential disagreement before it could become one. That was a learned behavior. It was the behavior of someone who had grown up understanding that disagreeing with Irene Voss was not something you did without a cost, and who had made peace with that understanding long ago. What she did not see, in those minutes in the dining room, was warmth. Not the theatrical warmth of public performance. Not even the comfortable, worn-in kind of warmth that exists between people who have known each other a long time and no longer need to perform it. She saw a formal working relationship between two people who happened to share a family name, and she thought, that is also information. Marcus Hale arrived on the 6th day. She learned his name before she saw his face, because B mentioned it that morning while they were preparing the guest room that had been requested for an overnight stay. Dorian's business partner, B said, tucking a corner of the sheet with the precise efficiency that 14 months of practice had given her. He comes about once a week, sometimes more. Him and Dorian, they are always in the study for hours when he visits. She paused. He is polite enough to staff. But, Sophia said. Bay considered this for a moment. He looks at people like he is calculating something about them. Marcus Hale was perhaps 35, with the kind of sharpness that some intelligent people carry in their faces like a visible current, always slightly active, always slightly evaluating. He was dressed carefully, but not showily, and he moved through the house with the confidence of someone who has been in it many times and considers it a familiar environment. He greeted the members of the Voss household he encountered in the entrance hall with the easy authority of a man who has learned that small social gestures pay large dividends. He did not look at Sophia when she crossed the hallway with a tray, but she looked at him. She watched Marcus and Dorian together that afternoon, briefly, through the partly open door of the library, as she was collecting glassware from the side table near the entrance. They were seated across from each other, each with a drink, speaking quietly. The door was not open enough for her to hear the words, but she could see the body language, and the body language was interesting. Dorian was leaning back, one arm over the chair, the posture of a man who was comfortable in a conversation, but beneath that ease, there was something careful. His eyes were steady on Marcus, with the quality of someone who is listening more than they are speaking, and Marcus was leaning slightly forward, elbows on his knees, the posture of someone making a case, or ensuring that the person across from them is still in agreement with something they have already committed to. It looked, Sophia thought, like an ongoing negotiation being conducted inside the appearance of a relaxed conversation between friends. The kind of negotiation that has been going on for a while, and that both parties have agreed, for their own reasons, to make look like something else. She moved on before she could be noticed, standing too long near the doorway. That evening, in her small room, she wrote in the notebook. She did not record what she had seen in any specific way. She recorded questions. What is the nature of the relationship between Dorian and Marcus Hale beyond what is visible? What decisions are being made in those closed study sessions? And the question that had been sitting quietly at the edge of her mind since the first day, the one she had not yet articulated even to herself, is there something here that is being deliberately concealed? Or am I simply watching private people guarding their private business, which is their right? She did not know yet. She knew only that she had more questions than she had arrived with, and that was always a sign that something was worth continuing to examine. On the 7th day, B cried in the laundry room. Sophia found her there at 2:30 in the afternoon, sitting on the low step beside the sorting table, with her hands in her lap and her face turned away. She was not making any sound. She was simply crying, in the silent, contained way of someone who has learned to do it quietly, because the alternative is showing something they cannot afford to show, in front of the wrong people. Sophia put down the bundle of curtains she had been carrying and sat on the step beside her, and she did not say anything for a moment. She had learned, over the years, that the first thing to say when someone is crying is often the least useful thing in the room. After a moment, B wiped her eyes with the back of her hand in a single, practical motion. "Sorry," she said. "Ignore me." "What happened?" Sophia asked. A pause. "They let Nina go today." Sophia was still. "Nina Cole?" "This morning. Said her services were no longer needed." Bia's voice was controlled and flat in the way of someone keeping a lid on something larger. She has been here 3 years, Sophia. 3 years. Her work was good. She never caused any trouble. And they said your services are no longer needed. And that was it. Did they give any reason? They never give a reason. Bia picked up a folded cloth from the table beside her and turned it in her hands without looking at it. That is the 4th person in under 2 weeks. And before that, there were 2 more in the week before that. 6 people. Gone. A pause. Thomas keeps saying something is happening in this house. He has been here 19 years, so when he says that, I pay attention. Do you have any idea what it is? Sophia kept her voice careful, just curious enough to seem natural. Bia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, no. And that is the part that worries me, honestly. When something is just happening, and nobody explains it, and the people who have been here the longest start disappearing, that is not a good feeling to sit inside. Sophia understood that completely. She also understood that she was sitting beside a person who had just given her a piece of information without knowing she had given her anything. I am sorry about Nina, she said. It sounds like she was good at her work and did not deserve it. She was kind, B said simply. She had a daughter, 7 years old. She used to show me pictures. She put the cloth down. Right, I need to get back to it. She stood up, smoothed her apron, and looked at Sophia with an expression that was tired but anchored. Do not tell Hilda you found me like this. She will think I cannot handle the work. I will not say anything, Sophia said. Bay nodded and left, and Sophia sat for another minute in the quiet laundry room with the sound of the machines and the smell of warm linen, and she thought about 6 people dismissed in under 2 weeks. She thought about the pattern forming at the edges of everything she had observed, not fully shaped, not named, but taking form. She picked up the curtains and walked back to her work. But that night, before she slept, she did something she had not planned to do yet. She took out the phone, and she typed a message to Clara through the encrypted line they had established. Start looking at the Voss Group financials from the outside. Registration documents, public filings, anything accessible. I will explain more when I can call. Clara's response came 11 minutes later, which was fast even for Clara. It said, already started. Call me when you are free. Sophia looked at those 3 words for a long moment. Already started. Clara had been watching from the outside, and had already seen something that warranted attention. She put the phone away and lay down in the dark, and thought about what that meant. She thought about it for a long time before she finally slept, and when she did sleep, it was lightly, the way she slept when she knew the next day was going to matter. The next day was going to matter. She was not supposed to be in the filing corridor. She knew this because Hilda had been very clear on the first day about which areas of the house were accessible to general staff, and the administrative corridor on the lower ground floor, which ran between the household accounts office and the private receiving room, was not one of them. Sophia had a legitimate reason for being near it, which was collecting a delivery confirmation that had been left on the wrong table. But she had gone 3 doors further along the corridor than the legitimate reason required, because she had heard a sound that her instincts had told her to follow. The sound was paper. More precisely, it was the sound of a machine destroying paper at high speed, which is a specific noise that most people do not register unless they are listening for it. She stopped outside the door of the accounts office. The door was not latched. It was open by 2 or 3 inches, and through that gap she could see the edge of a desk, and on the desk she could see a shredder, running, and feeding into the shredder, she could see a pair of hands pushing documents through steadily and quickly. She moved past the door without stopping, continued to the next doorway, and stood there with the delivery confirmation in her hand, thinking. Then she moved back past the accounts office door, as if returning the way she had come, and as she passed, she turned her head at the angle that allowed her the widest view through the gap. The person at the desk was not someone she had seen during her time at the estate. He was well dressed for a household staff member, which meant he was likely connected to the private administrative side of the operation, rather than the domestic side. He was perhaps 45 years old. He was focused entirely on the shredder. He was feeding documents through in groups, several pages at a time, steadily, with the practiced efficiency of someone working through a task that had been assigned to them, and that they wanted to complete before anyone came asking questions. What she saw on the desk beside the shredder was a partial stack of documents not yet fed through. She could not read them from the corridor. She could only see that they were financial in format, columns of numbers, the specific layout of accounting records or financial statements. And she could see, just above the edge of the remaining stack, the letterhead of the Voss Group. She walked back to the main service corridor, and she stood there for exactly 90 seconds, which was how long she gave herself to make a decision. Then she walked back to the accounts office, knocked twice on the door frame, pushed the door open, and looked in. The man at the desk looked up. His expression was neutral, but he stopped feeding documents for a moment, which was a reflex. "Sorry to interrupt," Sophia said, in the quiet, slightly apologetic tone that belonged entirely to Sophia Marin. "Hilda asked me to pick up the kitchen supply list from the admin desk. She said it was in this corridor, but I am not sure I have the right door." The man relaxed marginally. "Kitchen supply would be the second office on the left," he said. "This is accounts." "Oh, I am sorry. Wrong door. Thank you." She started to go, then turned back, as if suddenly uncertain. "While I am here, should I take anything upstairs? Sometimes Hilda asks us to carry things up for the office." "No," the man said. "Nothing going up today." She apologized again, and left. In the 5 seconds she had spent looking into that room, she had seen 3 things she had not been able to see from the corridor. The documents being shredded had reference numbers along their visible edges. The letterhead on the remaining stack showed not only the Voss Group name, but a sub-entity name that she did not recognize. She had read through every public filing and subsidiary register connected to the Voss Group that Clara had sent her, and the name she had just caught a fragment of was not in any of them. And the man at the desk had a small embossed card case on the corner of his workspace, which she had not been able to read in full, but from which she had caught several letters of what appeared to be a firm name that was not Voss. She went to the kitchen and stood at the sink under the pretense of washing up, and she took the camera button from her coat pocket, turned it over once in her hand, and put it back. She had not used it yet. She had been waiting for something worth using it on. This was worth using it on. The question was, how to get back into that office. The answer came that afternoon. The man with the shredder left the estate at just after 2 o'clock. She saw him crossing the drive from the window of the upper linen room, getting into a car she did not recognize, and driving away. He had a briefcase with him. The shredding was apparently finished for the day. She waited another 40 minutes. Then she told Hilda she had forgotten to check whether additional linens were needed in the ground floor guest corridor, which required her to pass the administrative section, and Hilda told her to go ahead and check, and Sophia walked to the lower ground floor with a plain expression and a calm step. She pushed open the door of the accounts office. It was empty. The shredder had been emptied, the waste bag removed and replaced with a fresh one. The desk was mostly clear, but on the corner of the credenza behind the desk, she saw exactly what she had hoped to see. 2 or 3 sheets that had been set to one side and not yet fed through, still sitting there in the particular way that overlooked things sit, slightly out of alignment with everything else, waiting for a second trip through the machine that had not yet happened. She picked them up. She took her phone from her coat pocket, held it over each page, and took 4 photographs. Then she placed the pages back exactly as she had found them, turned off the light she had not turned on, and walked out. In her room that evening, she sent the 4 photographs to Clara through the encrypted line without commentary. Clara called her 37 minutes later. "Where did you get these?" Clara said. Her voice was careful in the specific way that Clara's voice became careful when she was looking at something important. The administrative office. They were in the process of being shredded. All of them? Most of them. These were ones that had been set aside. A pause. The reference numbers on these documents correspond to transactions that do not appear anywhere in the Voss Group's public disclosures. I have been looking at their filings for a week now. These numbers are not there. I know. There was a sub-entity name on the header of the main stack. I only caught part of it, but I wrote it down. She read Clara the letters she had recorded in her notebook. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then, "I think that may be part of an offshore holding entity. I am going to need time to trace it fully. But Sophia, if I am right about what I am looking at, this is not standard financial management. This is money being moved in a way designed not to be found." Sophia sat on the edge of her bed. "How certain are you?" "Not certain enough yet. Give me 48 hours. I have 8 days left at the estate." "I know. Keep looking." She kept looking. Tomas Ward found her on the morning of the 9th day, while she was working on the front flower border, as an extension of her duties, covering the gap left by the departed members of the garden team. He came around the side of the house with his tools, and saw her there, and came to work alongside her, without making a production of it, the easy way of someone who is simply glad to have another pair of hands. They worked side by side for a while without speaking. It was comfortable in the way that working alongside someone with good instincts is always comfortable. Then Tomas said, without looking up from the rose bed, "You are not what you appear to be." Sophia's hands kept moving. "What do you mean?" "I mean you carry yourself differently than a person who has been in service their whole life. Your hands are wrong. The way you hold things is wrong." A pause. "I have been watching people work for a long time. I know the difference." Sophia clipped a dead bloom. She said nothing. "I am not going to ask you anything," Tomas said. "I am not curious in that way. I am old enough to know that people who arrive in a house with another purpose usually have a reason, and it is usually one of two kinds. The kind where they mean harm, and the kind where they are looking for something important." He glanced at her sideways, briefly. "You do not seem like the first kind." "I am not," she said. He nodded once, as if that settled it, and went back to the roses. After a while he said, "I have been here 19 years. I have seen this family go from a genuinely successful operation to something that looks successful from a long way away. But up close, when you are cutting the grass and nobody is thinking about you, the numbers do not add up. The spending does not match the kind of business those numbers suggest." He moved to the next section of border. A year ago, things changed noticeably. Staff started leaving. Not the ones who caused problems, the ones who had been here long enough to know things. Then about 3 weeks ago, they had accountants in from a firm I did not recognize. They were here 2 full days, and they did not speak to anyone on staff. When they left, Dorian's face was, he paused, finding the word, closed. The way a man looks when something has not gone the way he needed it to go. He did not say anything more. They finished the border, and Tomas thanked her for the help, and walked back toward the greenhouse. And Sophia stood in the morning air, with the smell of cut greenery around her, and she thought about what he had just described, and she thought about the documents in the shredder, and she thought about the 6 dismissed workers, and she thought about Marcus Hale, leaning forward in the library chair, making a case, ensuring agreement. The picture was not complete yet, but its outline was becoming very clear. She went back inside and sent a message to Clara. "How much longer do you need?" Clara responded within minutes. "I found the entity. I know what it connects to. You need to hear this on a call, not in a message." Sophia arranged to call her that night. She got through the rest of the day with the clean, focused efficiency she had developed over 10 days of hard work. She scrubbed and folded and carried and served, and was invisible in every room she entered. And all the while the outline of the picture kept sharpening in the back of her mind. That evening, she asked Hilda if she could stay an additional 4 days beyond her original placement, citing the gap in the staff and her willingness to cover the extra work. Hilda considered it for exactly 2 seconds and said yes. She had bought herself more time. That night, with her door closed and the lights off and her voice low, she called Clara. And what Clara told her changed the shape of everything she had assumed she was dealing with. The holding entity had been traced. It connected, through a chain of 3 intermediate structures, to the Voss Group's North portfolio, which was the real estate development arm that handled the largest capital-intensive projects. The North portfolio's apparent asset values were significantly inflated. Properties were being carried on internal valuations that did not reflect their actual market position, and the debt attached to those properties was considerably larger than anything in the public disclosures. The Voss Group was not what it presented itself to be, not even close. Sophia sat in the dark of her small room, and held the phone, and listened to Clara talk, and she thought, "I have not been watching a man who treats people badly. I have been watching a man who is managing a collapsing situation. And the management of that collapsing situation includes the engagement to Sofia Castellan." She had been watching the wrong thing, or rather, she had been watching the right thing without yet understanding what it was in service of. Now she was beginning to understand. And the understanding was very much worse than what she had come here expecting to find. She was not supposed to be lingering in the West Corridor at that hour. The dinner had finished at 9:30, and the glassware from the private sitting room adjacent to the dining room needed to be collected before 10, which was a normal part of the evening routine. She was on her second pass through the corridor, carrying the tray with the same careful balance she had developed over 11 days of transporting things that cost more than she was being paid for the entire week, when she heard the voices. The door of Dorian's private study was not fully closed, which was unusual. It was almost always fully closed when he was inside it, and she had assumed some small accident had caused it to drift, a draft from the high window at the end of the hall, or whoever had last closed it had not quite caught the latch. Whatever the reason, the door was open by perhaps 4 inches, and light was coming through the gap, and with the light came voices. She would have walked past. She was walking past, 3 steps beyond the door, her tray balanced, her footsteps silent on the carpet, when she heard her own name. Not Sophia Marin, not the name she had been wearing for 11 days. Sophia Castellan. She stopped. She did not choose to stop. Her body simply stopped, the way a body does when something in the external world registers as requiring complete attention. She stood in the corridor, with the tray of crystal glassware, and she listened. Marcus Hale's voice came first, loose and easy, with the relaxation of a man 2 drinks into an evening he considered safe. The Castellan money solves everything, Dorian. All of it. The North portfolio, the restructured entities, the exposure on the West contracts, all of it, cleared. It is an elegant solution. Then Dorian's voice, lower and more measured. It works if the timeline holds. The engagement ceremony is in 11 days. The legal framework for the merger can be filed within 1 week of the ceremony. Edmund's lawyers have already been briefed on the broad structure. Once it is signed, the Castellane capital becomes Voss capital within the operating entities. We have room to maneuver again. The old man does not suspect anything? Marcus again. Edmund? No. He sees what he wants to see. He wants this alliance. It gives the Castellan name a connection to old European money and long-established real estate development, which is something he has always wanted. We are giving him exactly what he wants, and he is not looking at what lies beneath it. A pause. The quiet clink of a glass being set down on wood. Then Marcus, with something different in his voice now, a note that might have been curiosity, or might have been the faint edge of a conscience that still existed somewhere beneath the calculation. And what about the girl herself? A silence of 4 seconds. She stood in the corridor with her tray, and she counted every one of them. Then Dorian's voice, even and considered, the voice of a man addressing a logistical variable rather than a person. Sophia Castellan is well managed. She attends her events, she meets her obligations, she was raised in a certain world, and she behaves as people raised in that world tend to behave. There is no reason to think she would be a problem. She has a reputation for being independent, Marcus said. There was something behind it now, a note that was not quite concern, but was at least the practical acknowledgement of a risk. Independent and difficult are not the same thing, Dorian said. She is private, she keeps to herself, she does not make scenes. She will settle once the merger is complete, and the structural period has passed. A brief pause. She seems manageable. Marcus again. The capital injection needs to be operational within 60 days of the filing. The creditor situation on the North portfolio is becoming serious. I know. The timeline is tight, but it holds. The Castellan capital does not just address the debt structure. It refinances the North portfolio and gives us the collateral we need for replacement contracts. We come out of the next 18 months in an entirely different position than we are in now. So long as she signs what she is going to be asked to sign. She will. She will be properly briefed by counsel. The documents will be in correct legal order, and she will sign. She is an intelligent woman. She will understand the value of the alliance. The sound of a chair shifting, someone rising. I will head up, Marcus said. Early morning. Good night. Footsteps crossed the room. The study settled back into quiet. Sophia stood in the corridor. She held the tray of crystal glassware in both hands, and she stood there, and she listened to the silence that had replaced the voices, and she thought about what she had just heard, and she thought about it with the complete and undistracted attention of someone who has been preparing for this moment without consciously knowing she was preparing for it. She did not break. She had wondered, in the abstract space where she had played out scenarios during the days before she came here, What she would feel if she found what she had come here looking for. She had assumed she would feel a kind of devastation. The sharp, clear grief of a specific hope destroyed. What she felt was not that at all. What she felt was clarity. The particular clarity that does not come from learning something completely new, but from having something you already suspected. At the quiet edge of honest thinking, confirmed in precise and specific detail. It was not a new feeling. It was the feeling of an argument inside yourself finally resolving. The part that had been saying I might be wrong finally going silent. The part that had been saying keep looking finally being answered. She walked to the end of the corridor. She turned into the service passage. She returned the glassware to the kitchen tray stand with the same care she always gave it, piece by piece, handling each one properly, because the work deserved to be done properly, regardless of what was happening in the rest of her mind. She wiped down the tray. She said goodnight to Rodrigo, who was finishing the kitchen close down, and he said goodnight back, and she walked down the service corridor to her small room, and she sat on the edge of the bed. She sat there without moving for 7 minutes. She was thinking about the specific words, not just what they meant in the broadest sense, which was clear and did not require elaboration, but the specific phrases, because specific phrases carry meaning beyond their content. They carry the assumptions of the person who said them. She will settle in once the merger is complete and the structural period has passed. Women in her position generally do. She had been defined, in that sentence, as a category, not a person with a specific mind and specific values and specific intentions, but a type, an heiress. A woman in her position, someone whose behavior could be predicted from the category rather than from the individual. Someone for whom individual consideration was not required because the category was sufficient. She seems manageable. She turned that word over slowly in her mind. Manageable, used for operational variables, used for logistics, used for things that need to be kept within acceptable parameters, not people who need to be understood or respected or considered. And the most important phrase, which was not about her at all, but which told her everything about the true nature of what she had been invited to enter into. The Castellan capital does not just address the debt structure. There was a debt structure. There was a real and serious and concealed debt structure, and the engagement, the ceremony, the merger, all of it was engineered as the mechanism for resolving it, using her family's money, without her knowledge, without her father's knowledge of its true purpose, and with the working assumption that she would be managed and would sign what she was asked to sign. She pulled out the phone and sent a message to Clara. I heard them. I know what this is about. Can you talk? Clara called her 19 minutes later. Sophia told her everything she had heard, word for word, because she had been storing it with precision from the moment she had frozen in that corridor, and she had not lost a single phrase of it. Clara listened without interrupting, which was unusual for Clara in a situation that warranted reaction. When Sophia finished, the silence lasted a full 6 seconds. Sophia, Clara said. Yes. I have spent 4 days building the financial picture from the outside. I was going to wait until you were clear of the estate to present all of it, because I did not want to influence what you were observing, but I need you to hear it now. Tell me. The Voss Group is not in the financial position it presents publicly. It is not close. The public filings show a business with managed debt and a solid asset base. What I have found, using the photographs you sent and the entity traces I have been running, is a business that has a significant portion of its visible assets encumbered by liabilities that are not reflected in any public disclosure. The North portfolio is the most serious problem, but it is not the only one. How serious? Without a substantial capital injection, the visible structure becomes unsustainable within 12 to 18 months. After that, things become very public very quickly. A pause, and the mechanism they have chosen for the capital injection is the merger with your family. Sophia absorbed that. The Harmon contracts, she said. Dorian mentioned them to Marcus. He said the contracts would have addressed the North portfolio's cash flow problem. The Harmon contracts were terminated 6 weeks ago, Clara said. I found the termination filing. It was submitted quietly to the relevant authority. No press release was issued. The Voss Group is still listed as an active partner on public databases, but the underlying agreement is gone. They buried it. Yes. Because a termination of that scale, made public, would have raised questions about the group's financial health that they are not in a position to answer honestly right now. Sophia sat in her small room in the dark, and she held the phone, and she thought about the scale of what was in front of her. Not just the engagement, not just her own situation. Her father, Edmund Castellan, who was intelligent and careful, but who had been given a coherent and well-constructed story by people who were skilled at telling it, and who had been kept socially occupied and charmed by Irene Voss for months, and who wanted this alliance enough that his scrutiny had perhaps not been everything it might otherwise have been. Her father was about to be seriously harmed by people he had extended real trust to, and he did not yet know it. "Clara," she said. "Yes. I need 4 things before I leave this estate. Everything you have found, fully documented. Evidence of the concealment of the Harmon termination, the complete entity traces, and the name of anyone inside the Voss Group's legal or financial structure who is not comfortable with what they are being asked to facilitate." A pause. A whistleblower. Yes. In a situation like this, they exist. They always exist. Someone knows something and has been carrying it alone. "I want to find them." "I will look," Clara said. "Sophia, how are you?" The same question she had asked once before, and the answer was the same, because it was the true one. "I will be," Sophia said, "once this is finished." She ended the call. She put the phone in its place in the bag. She turned off the lamp and lay in the dark of the narrow room, and she did not feel the things she had expected to feel. No grief. No outrage at having been underestimated. No bitterness at the specific calculation of "she seems manageable." What she felt instead was the particular, grounded calm of a person who has found their footing in a situation that was carefully designed to leave them without any. She had come here with a question. The question was answered. Now she had a different kind of work to do. She closed her eyes, and she slept, deeply and without disturbance, all the way to 5 o'clock. The documents arrived in her encrypted inbox at 11:43 at night, and she sat on the floor of her small room, with her knees drawn up and the phone balanced on them, and she read for 3 hours without stopping. Clara had sent 41 files. She had organized them with the meticulous precision that defined everything she did, each one labeled, each one cross-referenced, each one accompanied by a short plain language summary, because Clara knew that the person reading them at 11:43 at night, after 11 days of physical labor and emotional discipline, needed the meaning to be immediately clear. What they contained was the full shape of something that had taken years to build and was now very close to the point where it could no longer hold itself together. The Voss Group had been, 20 years ago, a genuinely substantial real estate and development enterprise. The public record showed its early growth clearly. The acquisitions, the development projects, the successful exits that had built the reputation and the name. That part was real. What happened in the decade that followed was a story of a different kind entirely. The expansion had been aggressive, and it had been financed in ways that were creative enough to look clean from a distance, but that Clara had now unraveled with the methodical patience of someone who does not give up when the path becomes complicated. The acquisitions of the mid-period had been funded partly through conventional debt, and partly through a set of investment structures that brought in capital from sources not disclosed in the public filings. These structures had been layered into holding entities, some registered in jurisdictions with limited disclosure requirements, and the relationship between those entities and the visible Voss Group was not documented in any public or regulatory filing Clara had been able to access. The key entity, the one whose letterhead Sophia had caught a fragment of in the accounts office, was registered in a small financial jurisdiction and had no public profile. But it connected, through a chain of 3 intermediate structures, directly to the Voss Group's North portfolio, which was the real estate arm that handled the group's largest and most capital-intensive projects. And what Clara had found, through a combination of the photographed documents and 5 days of careful trace work, was this. The North portfolio's apparent asset values were significantly inflated. Properties were being carried on internal valuations that did not reflect their actual position in the market. The debt attached to those properties was not fully disclosed, and the cash flow that was supposed to service that debt was not, in reality, sufficient to do so. The Harmon contracts had been the mechanism by which the group intended to close the cash flow gap. Those contracts would have brought in a volume of new development work that, properly executed, might have stabilized the position for several years. But the contracts had been terminated 6 weeks ago. The termination had been kept quiet, And with them gone, the North portfolio had no viable path to servicing its debt within the existing structure, which meant the Voss Group needed a capital injection, a large one, and it needed it within a timeline that was not flexible. The mechanism they had chosen was the merger with the Castellan family. Sophia sat on the floor of her small room and looked at the screen and thought about that. The engagement, the ceremony, the legal framework to be filed within a week, the Castellan capital entering the Voss operating entities within 60 days. Just over 2 months from the announcement at her father's dinner table, the fortune her family had built across 3 generations would be flowing into a structure designed to absorb it, directed by people who had assessed her as manageable, and her father as someone who saw what he wanted to see. She thought about her father. Edmund Castellan had not built what he had built by being careless with trust. He was intelligent and experienced, and he had seen people try to use him before, and had generally recognized it and responded accordingly. But he was also a man with a specific hunger, which was the hunger for the kind of old, established European prestige that the Castellan name, for all its commercial success, had never quite achieved. The Voss family's history gave them that prestige. The alliance gave Edmund access to it. And Irene Voss had understood this about Edmund within approximately 10 minutes of meeting him, because Irene Voss was very good at understanding what people wanted and offering it to them. Edmund had been given exactly what he wanted, in exactly the form that would make him least likely to look carefully at what came with it. The 37th file contained the information Sophia had asked for specifically. It was a short note from Clara. I made contact with a member of the Voss Group's legal team through an intermediary. His name is Daniel Ford. He is 29 years old and has been with the group for 2 years, working in contracts and compliance. He has been aware for approximately 8 months that documents he has been asked to prepare and manage were inconsistent with the group's public disclosures. He has not reported this to any authority because he does not know enough to proceed alone, and he is concerned about what happens to him if he speaks without proper protection. He is willing to talk to the right person. I believe he is genuine. He is ready to be contacted. She read it twice, put the phone down on the floor beside her, looked at the wall. Daniel Ford. 8 months of carrying something he did not know how to put down. 8 months of preparing documents he knew were wrong. In a situation where speaking meant risking everything, and saying nothing meant continuing to be complicit in something he had not signed up for when he took the position. She had seen this before, not in quite this form, but in the way all large institutions had their Daniel Fords, the people who were close enough to see clearly, but not positioned enough to act without being destroyed for acting. She sent a message to Clara. I want to speak to him directly. Set up a protected channel. Tell him he will not be alone in this. If he cooperates with a full disclosure, his position will be protected, his legal costs will be covered if it comes to that, and his employment record will be handled. Tell him I am the right person, and I mean what I say. Then she put the phone down and sat with what she knew. She thought about the scope of the deception, not just the financial structure, which was elaborate and had been built carefully over years, but the social engineering around it, the months of dinners and events that had been arranged with Edmund, the careful cultivation of his desire for prestige and connection, the way Irene Voss had positioned herself as a peer and eventual ally to Edmund in conversations about the alliance, making herself the visible face of the Voss family, while the actual situation of the group was being managed in private, the way the engagement itself had been framed publicly as a merger of equals, which was precisely what it was not. And then there was the assumption about Sophia herself. She seems manageable. She had been turning that phrase over for days, and she returned to it now, because it was the load-bearing phrase of the entire plan. The plan only worked if she was what they had assessed her to be. If she attended the ceremony, if she met with the lawyers, if she read what she was given to read, and understood it in the way it had been prepared to be understood, and then signed what she was asked to sign. She thought about the woman they had assessed. The public face of Sophia Castellan, cultivated and composed and appropriate, attending events and smiling for cameras and doing what was expected. She thought about how convincing that performance was, because it was genuine in its way. It was not false so much as it was partial, and the part they had seen was the part that looked exactly like what they had described. She seems manageable, she thought. I came here with a canvas bag and a second-hand coat, and I have found the shape of the thing you built, and now I am going to dismantle it. but carefully, and in the right order. Because there were people in the path of this who needed to be protected before anything became public, and she was not going to move until that protection was in place. She opened a new note on the phone, and she began to write. Not the financial picture, which was Clara's domain. Not the legal strategy, which was Patrick Drum's domain. A different list. The people who needed to be accounted for, and in what order, and how. Daniel Ford. The dismissed workers. B. Tomas. Rodrigo. Hilda. Her father. She thought about each of them in turn. She thought about what they needed, and what she could provide, and how to provide it without creating dependencies or complications that would compromise the larger process. She thought about this with the same practical attention she had been applying to the grout in the East Corridor for 11 days, and she did not romanticize it or make it bigger than it was. She had resources, and she had the will to use them correctly, and that was what the situation required. She wrote for an hour and a half. At 1:30 in the morning, she finished. She looked over what she had written. It was a plan, a real one, not a reaction and not a performance, a plan made by a person who had been paying attention. She put the phone away. She lay down on the narrow bed without changing her clothes, because there was no reason to, and she thought about nothing for a while, which was something she had learned to do in the past 11 days, and which she found genuinely useful, and then she slept. The alarm went at 5 o'clock. She got up immediately, washed her face, and went to begin the morning. She had work to do, real work, of both kinds, and she had 3 days left inside this house. She was setting the breakfast table when Dorian Voss walked into the dining room. This in itself was not unusual. She had been setting the breakfast table at 8:25 for 12 days, and on 4 of those mornings he had come in before she had finished. He usually did not look at her, which was to say, he registered her the way people register furniture they trust to be in the right place. He moved around her without acknowledgement, went to the sideboard, poured his coffee, and took his seat, and she continued with the table until she was done, and then she left. This morning was different. She was placing the last of the napkins when she became aware that he had stopped moving. She looked up, which she did not normally do, and found him looking at her. Not with recognition. She was absolutely certain of that. There was no moment of connection, no reaching for a memory, no second look. He was looking at her in the specific way of someone who has noticed something they cannot quite account for, a small discrepancy in something they thought they fully understood, the kind of thing that registers on the edge of awareness and holds there for a second before the mind moves on. She held his gaze for exactly the half-second appropriate for a member of staff who has looked up to check whether she is being spoken to, found she is not, and returned to her work. She placed the final napkin. She straightened the nearest chair. She picked up her empty tray and walked out. In the corridor, she walked at her usual pace. She turned the corner. She went down the service stairs. And she stood in the lower corridor for a moment, with her hand on the wall and her eyes on the floor, thinking. He had looked at her, not recognized her, but noticed her. Something had registered, just barely, at the edge of his attention. She did not know what had drawn it at that particular moment. Perhaps she had moved wrong, with too much of the specificity that belonged to her real self. Perhaps the light in the dining room had fallen differently. Perhaps it was simply the random attention that the mind sometimes gives to things without particular cause. It did not matter. The look had lasted less than 2 seconds, and he had moved on from it. But it told her something. She was closer to the edge of her cover than she had allowed herself to feel, and she had 2 more days inside this house. She spent those 2 days doing what needed to be done. She had spoken with Patrick Drum 3 evenings ago. Her father's private legal counsel, meticulous and direct, and the person in Edmund's life least likely to be dazzled by social prestige or a well-constructed story. She had reached out to him through Clara, not through her father's office, not through any channel connected to the formal engagement process. Directly. The message had said simply, "There are things you need to see before the engagement ceremony, and they cannot wait. Can you speak with me privately?" Patrick Drum had called Clara within 2 hours. She had spoken to him from the corridor outside the laundry room at 8 o'clock in the evening, 3 days ago, with the machines running behind the door to cover the sound of her voice. She had told him what she had found, methodically and completely, and she had sent him through Clara the 3 most critical documents. She had told him about Daniel Ford. She had told him where she was, and how she had come to be there. Patrick Drum had been quiet for a very long time during that call. When he finally spoke, he said, "Your father is going to be grateful that you are his daughter." He said it in the tone of a man who has encountered something he had not expected, and had found that it merited his respect. She had said, "Protect my father first. Make sure he is protected before anything else becomes public." Patrick had said, "Consider it done." She had spoken with Daniel Ford through an intermediary channel the following day. He was frightened in the way of someone who has been carrying something alone for too long, and is not sure, even now, that safety is real. She had been plain with him. She had told him exactly what she could offer, which was not everything he might have hoped for, but was real, and specific, and backed by people who could follow through. She had told him he was not alone in this, and would not be. She had heard the quality of his breathing change on the other end of the line, and she had understood what that meant, and she had not made it into something larger than it was. The fund for the dismissed workers had been arranged through Clara and through a trust that Sophia controlled independently, with no connection to the Castellan family structures or the engagement process. 6 people. She had their names from B's accounts and from Tomas's quiet recollections. Nina Cole and 5 others. The payments would go out cleanly and without a trail that pointed anywhere it should not point. By the time anyone thought to look, it would simply be a trust disbursement, unremarkable and routine. In the 2 final days, she spent time with each of the people who remained. She spent a morning with Tomas in the garden, the last section of autumn preparation that needed doing. They worked side by side in the way they had found together, comfortable and quiet, and without the need to fill the space between them with words. At one point, Tomas stopped and looked at the greenhouse and said, to no one in particular, 19 years is a long time to tend something that turns out not to be what it appeared. He did not look at her when he said it. She did not respond. She understood it was not a statement that required a response. When they finished, Tomas looked at her with the plain, uncalculating warmth she had come to trust more than almost anything she had encountered in this house. "Whatever it is you came here to do," he said, "I hope it goes well." "It will," she said. She spent time with Rodrigo in the kitchen, during the afternoon quiet, between lunch preparation and evening service. He was telling her about a dish he wanted to try, something complicated with technique he had been reading about, and she listened and asked genuine questions, and he talked with the animation of someone describing something they genuinely loved, and it was one of the simplest and best conversations she had in the entire 12 days. With B, it was quieter and more serious. They were in the linen room on her last full working day, folding the large table covers that required 2 people, and B was talking about her mother, the medical bills that had accumulated over 2 years, the way she managed them, sending money home each month, calculating what she could keep and what she could send. She talked about it without self-pity, the way she talked about everything difficult in her life, which was plainly, and without drama, because it was simply the structure of her life, and she had made peace with carrying it. Sophia listened. She folded her end of the linen with care, and she listened, and she did not say what she wanted to say, because she could not yet. She said instead, "Your mother is lucky to have someone who thinks about her the way you do." B looked at her with a small, tired smile. "I hope she agrees." They finished the linens, and B picked up her pile and walked out, and Sophia stood in the linen room for a moment alone, in the warm smell of clean fabric, and she thought about the fact that in less than 48 hours, everything in this house was going to change, and B did not know that yet, and she could not tell her. She went back to her work. That evening, she packed the canvas bag. She folded each item. The plain clothes, worn and washed and serviceable. The flat shoes. The notebook with its pages of notes and questions. The camera button that had done what it was brought to do. The phone in its clean case. And last, from the innermost pocket, the envelope with the photograph of her grandmother. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed and looked at the photograph. Her grandmother in the garden. The particular quality of her attention, always present, always clear, never performing anything it did not actually mean. Before you trust someone with your future, watch how they treat someone who has nothing to offer them. She had come here looking for the honest version of a person. What she had found was the honest version of a situation, and the 2 things were not the same, but in some ways the second was more important than the first, because the situation was what would have shaped the rest of her life, whether she had understood it or not. She put the photograph back in its envelope, and the envelope back in its pocket. She smoothed the side of the bag and closed it. She set the alarm for 5 o'clock, because she had one more morning of work to complete before she was done here, and she intended to complete it properly. The morning came. She completed it properly. She scrubbed and folded and cleared with the efficiency of 12 days of genuine labor, and she did every task she was given, fully and correctly, and when the morning routine ended at 8:30, she thanked Hilda in the plain, direct way that Hilda respected, and Hilda said the work had been satisfactory, and that a reference could be provided if needed. "Thank you," Sophia said. She meant it. She went to her room. She picked up the bag. She walked out of the service entrance for the last time, as Sophia Marin, into the cool morning air, and she walked the 2 streets to the car, and she got in, and she drove to the hotel where Clara was waiting. She changed her clothes. She sat in front of the hotel bathroom mirror and looked at herself, her shorter, darker hair, her plain face, and underneath all of it, the person who had been there all along, clearer now than she had been in a long time. She put on the jacket. Clara drove her to the estate. She walked through the front gate at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, and she rang the front doorbell, and she waited. The young man who opened the front door took one look at her, and his face did what faces do when they recognize a name but cannot quite believe the person attached to it is standing where they are standing. "Miss Castellan," he said. "Yes," she said. "I would like to see Dorian Voss, please." He showed her to the sitting room, adjacent to the main entrance. She stood in the middle of it, and she looked at it, the way a person looks at something they have seen before, but only from one specific angle, and now they are seeing it from all the others at once. The paintings on the walls, the particular quality of the light through the tall windows, the arrangement of the furniture, which she had dusted and polished and straightened at least 4 times in the past 12 days, while the room was empty, and nobody was watching. She stood in it as herself, and it was a different room. Dorian appeared in under 2 minutes. He was wearing a jacket over an open shirt, and he was already wearing the smile as he crossed the threshold, the practiced ease of it deployed and operational in the way that it always was when he entered a room where someone was waiting for him. "Sophia," he said, "this is a wonderful surprise. I thought we were not seeing you until Thursday evening." "I know," she said. Something in the flatness of it reached him. The smile stayed, but the quality behind it adjusted. He became slightly more careful. "Is everything all right? Has something happened?" "Yes," she said. "Please sit down." He sat, in the particular way of someone who has decided that sitting is the correct response to an uncertain situation, and she sat across from him, and she placed the folder she had been carrying on the low table between them. She left her hand on top of it. She said, "I have been in this house for the past 12 days. The room was very quiet. She watched his face move through the stages that faces move through when a person receives information that requires them to reassemble their understanding of the past 2 weeks. The first was confusion. The second was something she could only describe as rapid recalculation, the specific quality of a person going back through everything they said and did in the period being referenced and measuring it against the new information. The third was a controlled and careful version of alarm. And the fourth, arriving quickly, was the performance coming back on, reassembled efficiently, because he was very good at putting it on quickly. "I am not sure I understand," he said. "I think you do," she said. "But I will be plain. I arrived at your service entrance 12 days ago as a temporary placement from the household agency. I worked in this house as a member of domestic staff, under a different name. I was here the entire time." He was quiet for a moment. She watched him choose how to respond. "Why would you do that?" he said. His voice was still smooth, but there was something beneath it now that had not been there before. "Because I wanted to understand who I was agreeing to spend my life beside," she said. "And because my grandmother taught me something, when I was 12 years old, that I have never forgotten. She told me that before you trust someone with your future, you should watch how they treat someone who has nothing to offer them. That is the only honest version of a person. I came here to find the honest version." "I was in the West Corridor on Thursday evening," she said. "The door of your study was open. I heard your conversation with Marcus Hale." A pause. All of it. She opened the folder and placed the first document on the table between them. His eyes went to it. She watched them move across the page, and she watched his face register what was on it, and she watched him understand, in the way that people understand things that confirm they are in a situation beyond the point of management, that the document she had placed in front of him was real and sourced and specific, and was not the only one in the folder. "I would like to show you what I have found," she said. "Take whatever time you need." He did not speak. He read. She sat, and she let him read without filling the silence, because the silence was doing exactly what it needed to do. The footsteps on the staircase reached them before he had finished the third document. She heard them on the upper landing, measured and unhurried, and then Irene Voss appeared in the doorway of the sitting room. She stopped when she saw Sophia. For one full second, Irene Voss's face was entirely without its usual management. The layers were gone. What Sophia saw underneath them, in that single second of perfect candor, was not the contempt or the calculation she had expected. It was something closer to recognition, one person seeing another person clearly, without the benefit of the performances that both of them had been trained to maintain. It was brief, and it was genuine, and it was over, in a second, replaced by the layers coming back in their usual order, efficiently and completely. "Miss Castellan," Irene said. Her voice was as level as it always was. "We were not expecting you." "I know," Sophia said. "I have been here for the past 12 days. I was working in your household under a different name." Another second of something unguarded on Irene's face, and then it was gone again. She moved into the room and took a chair near the door, which was the position of a person who has chosen where to sit based on what it gives them access to, rather than what is most comfortable. Sophia looked at her directly. "I heard your son's conversation with Marcus Hale on Thursday. I have also been working with my father's legal counsel and with a member of your own legal team who chose to speak." Something moved through Irene's composure. Not a break, just a line appearing in it, fine and fast. Marcus Hale appeared in the hallway behind Irene a moment later, coming from the direction of the secondary staircase. He came to the doorway and stopped, and he looked at Sophia sitting across from Dorian, with the folder open on the table between them, and she watched him do what he always did, which was calculate, very fast, the situation he was looking at, and arrive at the conclusion he arrived at, which was that there was nothing useful to calculate here, because the situation had already moved beyond the point where calculation would do anything. The color in his face changed slightly. She turned back to Dorian. He had set down the document he had been reading. He was looking at the table in front of him, not at her, and his face was the face of a person who has reached a place in a situation where there is nothing left to perform, because the performance has served its purpose, and its purpose is finished. She said, "I have provided copies of everything in this folder to my father's private legal counsel, Patrick Drum. He began reviewing the material 3 days ago. The formal withdrawal from all engagement negotiations was filed this morning. You will receive the relevant documents today." She closed the folder. "A financial disclosure inquiry has also been initiated through the appropriate regulatory channels. I did not initiate it myself. It was initiated by a member of your legal team who was given the opportunity to speak and who chose to do so." Dorian looked up at her at last. His expression was not what she had expected. Not anger, not the specific wounded pride of someone who has been exposed by someone they had judged as a lesser opponent. It was something quieter and more complicated than that, and she did not have a name for it, but she thought it might have been a form of recognition, the same thing she had seen in his mother's face for 1 second in the doorway. "I came here because my grandmother told me to find the honest version before trusting someone with my future," she said. "I found something different than I expected to find. I did not find cruelty in you. I found desperation, which is different, and which I understand, even if I cannot excuse what was done with it." She looked at him steadily. "I want you to know that I am not your enemy. What I am is someone you significantly underestimated, and the consequences of that underestimation are now in motion." She stood up. She picked up the folder. She walked past Irene Voss in the doorway without pausing. She walked through the entrance hall, which she knew very well by now, the placement of everything in it, the exact number of steps between the sitting room door and the front entrance, the weight of the door handle. She walked through the front door and down the main drive and through the main gate. Clara was parked at the curb with the engine running. Sophia reached the car, and she stopped for a moment. She turned and looked back at the estate. The high stone walls, the long clean lines of the house above them, the formal entrance, and the deep green of the garden on either side of the drive. She looked at it for 10 seconds, not with regret, and not with the satisfaction of someone who has won something, with the clear, steady attention of someone who is finishing something they began fully, and doing it properly all the way to the last moment. Then she turned and got into the car. Clara pulled away without saying anything. After a moment, Sophia said, "It is done." Clara nodded once, and drove. The first thing Edmund Castellan did when Patrick Drum placed the documents in front of him was read them. He did not react immediately. He did not say anything. He read from the beginning of the first document to the end of the last, which took him 41 minutes, and Patrick Drum sat across the table from him, in the quiet of his private office, and waited, because he had learned in 15 years of working with Edmund that his silence was always productive silence, and interrupting it helped nothing. At the end of the 41 minutes, Edmund closed the final page. He placed both hands flat on the table. He looked at the wall to his left for approximately 30 seconds. Then he said, "My daughter did this." "Yes," Patrick said. "She went into that house as a member of staff. She did. She found all of this. She did. And she identified a cooperating witness from within the Voss legal team. And she ensured the relevant regulatory bodies were notified through the appropriate channels. She also arranged independently for the household staff, who had been wrongfully dismissed, to receive proper compensation." A pause. "She was very thorough, Edmund." Edmund Castellan sat with that. Sophia was in a chair by the window, where the morning light came in from the garden, and she watched her father's face. He was not a demonstrative man. He had spent 63 years developing the contained response as his default, even in moments when an uncontained one would have been understandable. But she watched his face now, and she saw something move across it that was not containment. It was brief, and he did not allow it to stay, but it was there. It was the face of a man who has seen something he was not prepared for, and does not yet know how to hold it, alongside everything he thought he understood about the person sitting across the room from him. He turned and looked at her. She looked back. "I would have signed it," he said. "Not to Patrick Drum. To her. If you had not done this, I would have signed it." "I know," she said. "I was careful. I believed I was careful." "They were very good at what they did," she said. It was not an excuse for either of them. It was simply the truth, stated plainly. He nodded once, looked at the table. Then, in a voice that was even and low, and without the quality of performance he usually carried, even with her, "I am sorry." She did not ask him to specify what he was sorry for, because he was the kind of man for whom specifying an apology was harder than making it, and she understood well enough what he meant. She said, "Thank you." They sat in the quiet of the office for another moment, both of them, before the practical work resumed, because that was what both of them knew how to do, and what the situation now required. The regulatory inquiry moved quickly once it began, and Sophia had not anticipated quite how quickly such things moved when the documentation was complete, and a cooperating witness was willing to speak without reservation. Daniel Ford had a great deal to say. He said it carefully and fully, and what he said gave the regulatory bodies exactly what they needed to move from preliminary inquiry to formal investigation within a matter of weeks. Daniel Ford's own situation, during the months that followed, was difficult, but not as difficult as it might have been. The legal protection held. The employment outcome, when it was settled, was fair. He moved to a position with a different firm in a different city, and he was, by any reasonable measure, a man who had done the right thing and had been supported in doing it, which was not always how that story ended. The Voss Group's situation became public in stages, the way these things do, each piece of news arriving before the public had fully processed the one before it. The regulatory action, the suspension of key licenses, the revelation of the off-book liabilities, the Harmon contract termination being examined in the light of the misrepresentations in the group's public filings. The picture assembled itself over 6 weeks in the public record, and it was considerably less clean and considerably more complicated than the single sharp revelation that news stories prefer, because the truth of how these things are built tends to be messy and layered and resistant to simple telling. Dorian Voss gave no press interviews during this period. Irene Voss left the country with remarkable efficiency and settled somewhere in southern Europe, and the press eventually found her there, but she gave them nothing of value. Marcus Hale retained counsel and released a statement that said he looked forward to the opportunity to provide full transparency in the appropriate forum, which was the kind of statement people release when they are in difficulty but believe there is still a path through it. What became of each of them was not Sophia's concern. She had done what needed to be done, and she had done it through the proper channels, and the proper channels would proceed at their own pace and in their own way. What was her concern were the people who had simply been in the path of it. The dismissed workers received their payments within 2 weeks of the arrangement being finalized, 6 people in total. Nina Cole's payment arrived through an intermediary, and Nina sent a message to the agency placement system, not knowing who it had come from, that said simply, "Thank you. Whoever did this, thank you." Sophia read that message and kept it. B. Fletcher was still working at the estate when the inquiry became public, and the situation of the estate during the investigation was uncertain for a period. But Sophia had spoken with Patrick Drum about B specifically, and Patrick had ensured that the domestic staff received proper notice, fair settlements, and employment references that could not be contested in the process. B, with her settlement added to her accumulated savings, paid off the entirety of her mother's medical debt, which she had been working toward for 2 years. Sophia learned this because Bea mentioned it in a brief message she sent to the agency placement platform for the file of a temporary worker named Sophia Marine, which Clara intercepted and forwarded. B said, "If you are ever back this way, Sophia, I hope you are doing well. Working with you was one of the better parts of a difficult few months." Sophia replied, as Sophia Marin, that things were good and that the time working alongside Bea had been one of the better parts for her as well. Which was true in both identities. She meant it in both. Tomas Ward retired. He had been talking about retiring for 3 years, and then one afternoon, several months after the estate situation had resolved, he appeared at the door of an address he had tracked down through a mutual connection, because Tomas, for all his unhurried quality, had his own form of determined attention when he chose to apply it. He stood at the door with a plant from the kitchen garden in his hands, a cutting he had rooted himself, and when Sophia opened the door and saw him, she stood still for a moment before she smiled. He said, "I knew you were not what you appeared to be from the first week." "I know you did," she said. "Would you like to come in?" He came in. She made tea. He told her he was spending 3 days a week working in a community garden in his neighborhood, which was exactly the right thing, and she thought about him in that garden, and felt something quiet and real that she did not try to name, because some feelings are simply true and do not need names. Rodrigo Santos opened a restaurant. Not immediately, but within 8 months. He found a space, found a partner, and opened a small place in a street he liked, with a simple menu and a kitchen run the way he had always wanted to run one. The reviews were good. She went once without telling him she was coming, and she sat at a table near the window and ordered everything she recognized from the dishes he had talked about in the kitchen corridor during the long-ago mornings of her 12 days, and all of it was excellent. When he came out after the service and saw her, he stood still for a moment, and then he laughed, which was entirely Rodrigo. Her relationship with her father changed, not all at once, and not without difficulty. The apology in Patrick Drum's office had been real, but apologies are always beginnings rather than resolutions, and the thing they were trying to build from that beginning required more work than a single moment of honesty, however sincerely it was offered. They worked at it, both of them, in the careful and sometimes uncertain way of two people who have been performing their relationship for a long time and are now trying to find out what it actually is when the performance falls away. It was not perfect, but it was real, and real was what she had been looking for all along. She became involved, as an investor and eventually as a governing voice, in a fund that provided legal support and fair settlement advocacy for workers in domestic employment who had been dismissed without cause. It was not announced with a press release. It did not appear in the charity bulletins of the world she came from. It existed, and it worked, and it helped people who needed help, and that was all she needed it to do. The press told several versions of what had happened in the months surrounding the inquiry. Some of them mentioned Sofia Castellan as a peripheral figure, the heiress whose engagement had dissolved when questions emerged about her fiancé's business practices. A few came closer to the real shape of it. None of them got it right, because none of them had been in the West Corridor at 10 minutes past 9 at night, holding a tray of glassware, listening through a gap in a door that had drifted open. None of them had spent 12 days being invisible in order to truly see. She thought about her grandmother sometimes. In the evenings, in the apartment she had stopped performing for anyone, and had simply begun to live in. She thought about the garden, and the afternoon light, and the question her grandmother had asked about a girl at school, all those years ago. How does she treat the people who serve her lunch? She had not been paying attention then. She was paying attention now. She was always paying attention now. And on the days when the world asked her to perform, to be Sofia Castellan, to be the public face, to be the appropriate and composed version of herself that large rooms sometimes required, she did it. She was good at it. She would always be good at it, because it was a real skill, and she had spent a long time developing it. But she knew the difference now, between the performance and the person. And the person was someone she had found, finally, in a narrow service corridor, with a scrubbing brush, and a canvas bag, and a plain, borrowed name that no one in any room she entered had looked at twice. That person was not going anywhere. She was home.